Okay, looks like we are live now on YouTube, and you should all have the little "it's being live streamed" sort of message. And people are still trickling in, but I think we're going to make a start because there is a bit of an intro for me to do before I hand over to Ollie. So good evening, everyone, or good morning, depends where you are. I know there's lots of people from all over the world from the names I can see on the chat. I'm Dr. Dimitra Fimi. I'm Senior Lecturer in Fantasy and Children's Literature, and I co-direct the Centre for Fantasy and the Fantastic here at Glasgow. I'm also leading this AHRC-funded research network, Future Voices of Scottish Science Fiction and Fantasy, which explores how creative practitioners, so authors and artists and musicians and game designers, how they imagine future worlds and respond to a rapidly changing global world and circumstances, concerns, anxieties, all of those things through SFF writing, art and creativity. This network is the first step towards building a strong collaboration between academics, creative practitioners, fans and stakeholders with a view to contributing to the agenda and conversations leading up to Worldcon 2024 in Glasgow, which when we were writing this felt like a long way away, but it's quite close now. It's tangible. And my co-investigator, Professor McCallum Stewart, is of course also the chair of the Glasgow Worldcon. We'd like to thank the HRC for funding this project, as well as the project steering group made up of science fiction and fantasy publishers, editors, academics, Glasgow Worldcon and other convention committee members, and also the Scottish BIPOC Writers Network. Tonight's event is our last one, I can't believe it. I'm going to be quite bereft after this, I think. The last out of 4 public events the network is organising, and we're focusing tonight on challenging the past, canon and history in science fiction and fantasy narratives. And I'm really delighted and very excited to be welcoming amazing contributors tonight, and we'll be hearing from all of them later on, and they will be introduced to you by our chair, who I will introduce right now. Our chair this evening is Oliver K. Mead. He's a Scottish author and poet. His most recent novels are Glitterati and Birds of Paradise, and his long-form poem Dark Star was one of the Guardian's best books of 2015. He has a doctorate in fine art from the University of Glasgow and works as a lecturer in creative writing at the University of Lancaster. We've lost Ollie, I can't believe this. We worked together for a while. In late 2018, he was the writer in residence at the European Space Agency's Astronaut Centre in Cologne, about which I'm very, very envious every time. Before I pass on to Ollie, a couple of very small practical things. If you have a question, please post it on the Q&A box, and please indicate if the question is specifically for one of our speakers or a more general question for all of them. Please don't use the chat for questions, as we can very easily miss them. Please continue to use the chat as you're already doing to post comments, reactions, etc. I should also remind you that this event is being recorded and live streamed via the YouTube channel of the Centre for Fantasy and the Fantastic, and the recording will remain on that channel and the project's website. The chat will also be automatically saved so that we can trace and preserve ideas and suggestions and feedback. So I will now pass on the baton to Ollie.
Hello, thank you very kindly for that introduction. I'm super excited to be here today. So here's how we're going to go through this panel today, just so you know. Each participant, including myself, very generous, has been given 5 minutes to introduce themselves in whichever way they want to as regards the topic, doing readings, maybe discussing the topic at hand, before we get into questions and talking as a panel amongst ourselves. And then for the final part of this panel, we'll be moving on to audience questions. So yeah, if you do have questions, please throw them in the Q&A. So before I introduce everyone, I'll give a slight overview to this, which is kind of my introduction to this piece. Yeah, I'm pleased to be here today because this topic that we're looking at is very important. To give context, this panel is part of a series occurring in partnership between a handful of universities, including the University of Glasgow, and Glasgow in 2024, the Glasgow Worldcon bid. For those who don't know, Worldcon is one of the world's biggest and most influential science fiction and fantasy conventions, and features one of the most coveted prizes in SFF, the Hugo Awards. And as you may or may not know, both Worldcon and the Hugos are historically quite controversial, especially in recent years, where issues of diversity and representation have been at the forefront of both. Thus, conversations like this, in anticipation of what will be an enormously important event for SFF the world over, are crucial. This panel and the other panels taking place as a part of this series represent a step towards addressing serious issues that continue to be at the heart of SFF. Conversations like this are important, and we need to keep having them. The topic for this panel in particular is about SFF canon, and I'm so pleased to be chairing a series of panelists that I would characterize as being responsible for the new SFF canon as it emerges. I teach the Edinburgh Nights series and Deep Wheel Orcadia, and many of my new undergraduate students arrive at university having already read This Is How You Lose the Time War. Iain's art is the face of Glasgow in 2024 and will characterize the event in the minds of all who attend. This is the new canon. Briefly, because I'm taking advantage of the opportunity, going to read you a very quick little excerpt from a bit of upcoming work of my own, which is a couple of stanzas from a verse novel I have being published next year called Calypso. At the heart of Calypso, a story about faith and terraforming, is a post-human, non-binary character, and I wanted to introduce them to you. This is Catherine. Think of a child born too small, its tiny heart trembling, skin so thin its veins are visible, a red wrinkled thing, helpless and dying, needled and cocooned we were saved. Augmented, our fluttering mothwing heart given blue whale strength so that our blood became ocean blood, washing waves through us. When we grew up, we felt the moon's tidal tug in our veins. We waxed and waned with dear Luna's seasons, our ocean blood jewelly pulled by her orbit and influenced by her silver glow, our hearts still remembering its mothwing flutter. Our marrow was made sap, a sickly golden syrup, giving our bones bow strength so that no part of us might ever be snapped. Our knuckles and knees were the knots of trees, and we would often stand with our feet buried in the soft earth, spreading our toes like burrowing roots, wrists bared up to the sun. We felt our earth seasons run deep through our sap marrow, every winter hibernating, lulled always by the frosty chill, and every spring blushing the colours of autumn blossom. Each year added a ring to our bow bones, increasing our wood forest fortitude until we became not a tree, but a grove entire. Our eyes were enhanced to falconic sharpness and augmented further still. Inspired by the senses of migrating birds, we too can feel magnetic fields. They emerge in sight as strict silvery threads netted across the domed whirl of the sky, and they tingle the tips of our fingers should we close our proximities, if we too might know them through our feathers while in flight. We can also see some radiations, a shimmering misty haze and ultraviolet light making the faces of flowers neon and the wings of insects deliciously bright. We would gaze often at beetle shells, their refractive carapaces, an endless delight. I, us, we, the chimera, a child born sickly and in every way improved. That's me. So now I have the pleasure of introducing our panelists, and I'll be going down the list as it's presented on the website. So I don't even think this is alphabetical. I have no idea what order this is, but surprise, Iain, you're up first. Iain is an artist. Iain Clark is an artist working primarily in acrylics and acrylic inks, and also oils, pencils, inks, and digital coloring. He's currently producing artwork for the Glasgow 2024 Worldcon and has twice won the BSFA Best Artwork Award for Glasgow 2024 works, Shipbuilding Over the Clyde in 2020 and Glasgow Green Woman in 2021. He's also a prolific fan artist. Iain, take it away.
Hello. I knew you were going to make me go first. As I am an artist and I can't really do a reading of my work, I thought I would just share some of my artwork as part of this. So forgive me while I just share my screen for a second. I suppose I could just do the audio described version of my artwork. That would be a thing. So I have difficulty in trying to both introduce myself and address myself to the topic I think here. So I probably won't take a whole 5 minutes, but I'm extremely honoured to have been invited here. I'm not Scottish, as you can hear, despite the spelling of my name, and lots of people I know, because I'm associated with Glasgow, assume that I'm Scottish, but I'm Scottish in the same way that Joe Biden is Irish, which is to say I have a small fraction of Scottish blood somewhere in my lineage. So I've been involved in the Glasgow bid. I got involved really because I had previously been involved in the Dublin 2019 Worldcon, and I did a lot of artwork for that. And I guess I'm given an extremely free remit in doing artwork for Glasgow. It's not paid, it's volunteered, as all people who work for Worldcon are volunteers, and I'm pretty much given as much freedom of expression as I like, as long as I'm broadly producing things that are relevant to the convention. And so I'm kind of self-directed in a way, and I'm working with a group of extremely open-minded and progressive people who are really interested in Scotland and Scottish history and the history of science fiction and fantasy. And as much as anything, what I'm trying to do, I guess, in working with Worldcon is sort of take elements of SFF canon, you might say, and elements of Scotland, Glasgow in particular, and trying to meld those together in interesting and hopefully not tropey, stereotypical kinds of ways. I'm conscious when we talk about diversity as parts of this conversation that a lot of the works I've been doing for Glasgow have been very landscape based, and really we've adopted in some ways a theme which is almost the railway poster, the travel poster, and a lot of them are sort of scenes and landscapes. But really, in as much as I'm interacting with the SFF canon, I think this picture is perhaps a good example, which is shipbuilding over the Clyde, which I hope you can see, which was sort of an attempt to do a number of things that are kind of, I think, relevant to this panel. So one of them is to obviously illustrate something uniquely Glaswegian and draw on an aspect of Glasgow. In this case, it's kind of industrial and shipbuilding heritage. It's also an homage to Norman Wilkinson's amazing and much better than this railway posters, including one specific one called Shipbuilding on the Clyde. And it's also an attempt to try and draw on some of the things that interest me in the visual language of SFF history. So in this case, the spaceship is somewhat of a hybrid of ideas from people like Chris Foss, and also from the Terran Trade Authority books in the 1970s. There's collections of kind of weird and alien and in some respects quite abstract and in some respects quite realistic and greebly kind of spaceships. And I'm trying to bring those influences together and produce something that sort of celebrates the history and traditions of Glasgow whilst bringing to it an element of that SFF canon too. That's the goal anyway. All of that sounds very highfalutin, but really I had the idea in the shower, dashed out of the shower, scribbled it down and then painted it. So, you know, there are layers and there are layers. I have a few other pictures which I can briefly go through, but I'm not going to go through all of them. But just as an indication, because not everybody watching this, I'm sure, will be familiar with any of my work. And another one that I did is the Glasgow Green Woman, which the left-hand one is one I did for Dublin, which was my first attempt at a green woman, and which is sort of playing a bit with negative space and having the borders of the image intrude on it. But it's quite a flat image. And I was interested in drawing something that resembled the sort of wooden carved bosses of green men, but giving it a different kind of an energy, I guess, and something a bit more feminine, obviously, and trying to get away from the stolid, heavy kind of oaken male kind of imagery of a green man and turn it into something else. And when I was thinking about Glasgow, I was again interested in making that kind of imagery from Scottish as much as English folklore, kind of giving it some other flavor. And so in this case, again, I'm trying to play with the space, and trying to bring a sort of great mass of things to the right and then a very small focus on the left and so forth. And I tried to do that by weaving into a very light and open shape lots of different Scottish plants and flowers, and for my wife who collects carnivorous plants, a little sundew in there somewhere as well, and create something which is sort of originally it was going to be almost a bit Art Nouveau and Rennie Mackintosh, and I had some very Art Nouveau fronds in the bottom, but I think it kind of moved away from that and became something a bit more free and a bit more trying to encapsulate something about mythology, but in a different way and with a different energy. And that's kind of what I've been trying to do through a lot of my art. I haven't had tons of figures in my art, but where I do, I pretty much always try and pick on female iconography. I try and pick on female folklorish images like Selkie. One of the other ones I did, which I hesitate to pronounce, it'll reveal exactly how not Scottish I am, is the Blue Lady of Winter, which I think is pronounced something like Cailleach Beer. And I've been trying to go through the things that interest me about Scottish folklore and bring to them a different spin. So I think I'll more or less leave it there, but if I just briefly show a couple more of my artworks. So this is Sailing over Glasgow, which is drawing on a sort of Peter Pan iconography against some of Scotland there. We have a couple here that you may be familiar with, particularly the one on the left, because it's been used on an awful lot of banners for Glasgow 2024, which is again trying to take something of the industrial heritage of Scotland and Glasgow and fuse it with something of the more traditional kind of Scottish background, as it's the stag. And then lastly, we have on the left the suffragette oak from Glasgow, which was planted in 1918 to commemorate women getting the vote by various suffragist groups in Glasgow, and the Blue Lady, who I'm not going to attempt to pronounce twice, on the right hand side. So I think I will stop sharing there. I have no idea how long that took, but I will pause there.
Thank you so much, Iain. I've loved being able to see all these pieces in one slideshow. They're amazing. We'll move on to Amal. So Amal El-Mohtar is an award-winning writer of fiction, poetry, and criticism. Her stories and poems have appeared in various magazines, anthologies, and in her own collection, The Honey Month, 2010. She is an author with Max Gladstone of the multiple award-winning This Is How You Lose the Time War, and she has been the New York Times' science fiction and fantasy columnist since February 2018.
Hello, thank you so much for that. I just want to say, Iain, that art's magnificent. Like, especially I was like, I gasped when I saw the metal structure one. That was, anyway, I should bring my focus in. Thank you so much for that introduction, Oliver. I am also going to make sure that I have a bit of a time. Okay, for 5 minutes. So to speak briefly to the sort of research question of the panel, I am interested in. I'm very, very interested in the idea of a canon and what constitutes a canon. And I always want to use the indefinite article when we say it, right? Because even when we're talking about, whether we're talking about a specific thing, like saying SFF canon and so on, the idea that there is the canon or something like that is something that I have a lot of difficulty with, purely for many reasons, but the main one being that I don't feel like I was introduced to one in the same way that, for instance, I overstudied the canon of English literature, which again, many canons in English literatures. But the idea of a canon for me partly is of being inducted into a set of ideas, inheritances, with the notion that there is something that you are going to perpetuate from that receipt. And what I feel I do in my work, and what I've tried to do in my teaching of creative writing and of fantasy literatures when I've had to do that, is to complicate that idea of both the receipt of the inheritance and also of what exactly it is that inheritance is constituted of. So there was I taught a fantasy literature course for a few years, where the organizing principle of the course for me was attempting to put contemporaneous texts in conversation with each other, to sort of try to read them by each other's light. And we began with, I tried to start a course by setting out the parameters in which we're investigating these stories together and so on, rather than try to replicate what my education consisted of, which was, here are the texts, these are the important texts, these are the ones you're going to, the 6 dead white men that you're going to read forever and keep talking about in many different ways and so on. But more than that, I'm very, very interested in ideas of recuperation whenever we have a canon. Whenever there is something that is put forward as, here are the things that we have, I'm very interested in saying, well, what did we lose along the way in order to have these things? So this kind of found expression in my scholarship. I was doing doctoral work on representations of fairies and other supernatural creatures in Romantic era British literatures. And one of the interesting things to me was, pairing authors together to see what could sort of oscillate between their works. So Sir Walter Scott and James Hogg were 2 of them, for a more like Scottish focused perspective. And to sort of see that, like, Hogg, for me as a Canadian, was definitely sort of in the shadow of Scott. And there's this idea of just like anything that is put forward as a monument, whether it's in literature or history or whatever, casts a shadow and obscures other things. And it's in that shadow that I'm really interested in digging in and seeing what was there, because whatever we currently have around us, I firmly believe always existed. And is there to be unearthed and found and dug up out of like what has become subterranean. So I'll also say, like Iain, I feel adopted into Scottishness. I've married in. I'm married to a Glaswegian, and I'm very, very excited about Worldcon in Glasgow, partly because I felt, after having lived in the UK for 6 years, it was really when I went to Scotland that I felt like I actually felt like I found family and adoption and so on. So that I feel very honored to be here under those auspices. And I thought, for that reason, I wanted to also read a small poem for you that I wrote, that I began writing while I was in Glasgow. And that speaks to some of these ideas that I enjoy playing with, of memory and inheritance. So my family is from Lebanon. My parents came to Canada during the Civil War. I was born in Canada. We went and lived in Lebanon for 2 years, 2 very formative years when I was little. And it was during that time that I read a lot of the books that kind of set me on a path of fantasy literature and all these things. It was when I first encountered Doctor Who in novelization form. It was when I first read The Hobbit. There were many things like that. But I also had this experience of being caught out in the rain in Beirut with my mother and my sister. And we took shelter in this place called Hammam al-Askari, which translates to like the bathroom of the soldiers. It's really like a soldier's barracks, essentially. And and then like there was this tremendous storm, and I remember like watching it, and in a sort of animistic impulse that a lot of children had, tried to like talk to the storm and tell it to stop so that we could go home. And then I remembered this when I was in Glasgow, because there was a tremendous and very rare thunderstorm in the title on July 25th, 2013. And I, as I was watching the rain, that memory came back to me, and I thought I would just read this poem to you. So it's called Thunderstorm in Glasgow July 25th, 2013. Rattle my heart, four-chambered sound, loosen my language from my teeth, tumble ra'ad out from a fallow throat and a forgotten year, when hunched in barracks beneath the rain that gushed from gutters, corrugated roofs, one sister clutched her mother's hand and one strained against her grip, wanting the wet, the loud, the dark, the bright, to shake hands with that searing flash and make it her friend. Say Asfi, say Ghaimi, unbury the words with this digging rain. Remember how gardens seemed to sprout from stone as water struck it, drops unnumbered, fountaining upwards as if to try for a place in the sky again. Say Askar, say Hammam. Recall wondering why soldiers needed such a big bathroom anyway, while the storm sluiced over eaves and doors and stirred into the sea. Gather the words like clouds to burst, but remember too the vicious truth. When the sky lashed hard and cracked the air, when you hipped your fists and stared it down, shouting patience, shouting peace as only a child can. You left Ra'ad, Ghaimi, Asfi, Hammam, Askar in your mother's hand, spoke English to the rain. And I'll leave that there. I'll also, if it's not obnoxious, drop a link to the poem because there is a, this appeared in Fireside magazine and Molly Crabapple did an absolutely stunning illustration of it. And the interaction of the Arabic words within the English words was a particular triumph of Pablo de Fendini's web design. So I just thought I'd share that there.
It was a brilliant reading. Thank you very much. Next up, we've got Harry Josephine Giles, who is from Orkney and lives in Leith. Her verse novel, Deep Wheel Orcadia, was published by Picador in October 2021 and is short, well, and won the Arthur C. Clarke Award. This is out of date. She has a PhD in creative writing from Stirling. Her show Drone debuted in the Made in Scotland showcase at the 2019 Edinburgh Fringe and toured internationally. Josie.
Thank you. Yeah, this panel's been planned for a long time, hasn't it? Must have sent that bio in a little while ago. That's fun. That's fun. It's very nice to be here. It's very nice to be speaking with you all. Thank you so much. And yeah, I'm pleased to get to be part of this discussion. And I'm now like wrenching myself away from this indeed really beautiful piece of web design and graphic design on that poem. It's stunning. So do have a look at that. I will bookmark that for later and focus. So here we are. I'm going to also speak a little bit to the research question, and then I'll try and keep that brief so I can read you a little bit from the book. So we've got this research question, right? How do contemporary practitioners respond to the established SFF canon by challenging narrow mindsets and the lack of diverse representations? And without wishing to be too thrawn about it, like when I read that question, my first response was just, well, I don't, and I don't particularly wish to. I'm really interested in the temporality. If we're going to be talking about sci-fi, I'm really interested in the temporality of this question. This idea, it's a really common temporality now. I think of it as the temporality of repair. This idea that we have an institution that is broken in some way. And in this case, the way that it is broken is that it's not diverse enough. And what we have to do is repair that institution by making it more diverse. And I find that quite, it's the Star Trek vision of the future is what it is a future in which everyone is diverse enough and the world has enough resources and we can somehow maintain all of the ideological and economic structures of empire, which is what the Federation is, and make it look diverse, and it won't be bad anymore. Like that's the Star Trek vision of the future, and it's it's a form of liberal utopianism. And so we imagine this better future in which there's enough of all of the different kinds of people, all getting enough of the resources, and then we summon the idea of that future into the present with the wish for greater diversity in the present. And I find that temporality of repair a little disappointing as a way of orienting oneself to the world as it is now. A little lacking in imaginative ambition of how else the world can be, right? So I'm wondering, like, what are some of the other temporalities that we can engage with, rather than, you know, projecting to this perfect future and poorly imitating it in the present? What do we have in the past that we might want to bring into the now? Whenever I see the canon isn't diverse enough at the moment, what can we do to diversify the canon? I think, well, actually, I don't know what canon you're talking about, because my canon's great. Like, my bookshelves, they're pretty nice. I like them. Look at them all. They're very nice. And they're full of books that aren't necessarily in a received canon, but that have nourished me. So just purely thinking from like a trans literature perspective, which is one of the canons that I write myself into, and one of the canons that I draw strength on. One of the writers who has guided me and paved a way for me more than any other is Rachel Pollack, who we lost just the other week, who is tremendously successful and prolific as an author, won a bunch of the awards, and still for some reason doesn't appear in the canons. Is that because she's trans? I don't know. Or maybe not. I don't know. Is it because what she's writing was too interesting? I don't know. And then I go further back and I think about Beatrice the 16th, this bizarre and actually kind of awful post-gender utopian novel written by the lawyer, the legal theorist and writer and feminist Irene Clyde, who's also a trans woman, who was writing at the beginning of the 20th century and was one of the editors of the private feminist journal Urania. And this is another, it's one of the very early genderless utopia novels, which is now a major genre. It's one of the very first forms of that, written by somebody who is in some form trans, although her trans identity is very complicated. And again, it's a novel that's almost been entirely forgotten. And so I reach into the past and I think, actually, here's a different temporality that I can draw into, is a sense of continuity with what's there. And similarly, another temporality that I think is interesting, rather than this like utopian projection into the future, is the temporality of the cycle and of repetition and of things spinning and spinning and spinning, and a sense that these conversations have been had before in some form and they'll be had again in some form, and some of the contexts change and some of the contexts are the same, and thinking in that kind of spiral or circular temporality, it actually takes a little bit of the pressure off, because sometimes as quote unquote diverse authors, we like carry this like weight of utopian responsibility on our shoulders, where we are supposed to bring this diversity into the canon. It sounds very tedious, actually, having to do all of that, and letting that go and thinking instead in terms of a cycle. This work has been done in the past, this work will be done in the future. The past and the future are layered onto this present. That makes it easier. So with all of that said, that's my I hope I'm not being too rude to my hosts here, but I think this is the kind of response that you wanted. So I'm hoping it is. I'm going to read you just one scene or poem from the book. So this is my last book. It's called Deep Wheel Arcadia. It is a sci-fi verse novel that is set in a world that is almost but not entirely unlike contemporary Orkney, which is the islands that I grew up in. And it is set in a space station on the fringes of an interstellar culture, and in a space station that has been set up for resource extraction. They are extracting this slightly mysterious fuel, which they refer to as the lights. And the space station is going through a period of major socioeconomic change, which is partly being brought about by the dawn of faster than light travel, which is essentially threatening to leave this particular outpost behind as people jump further away. And it's a future, but it's a future that actually imagines the Orkney of it imagines the Orkney in the period of British imperial expansion, when we were a major trading post and supply post for a lot of imperial and colonial voyages. It also imagines the Orkney of the period of increasing oil extraction, and how that period of oil extraction utterly changed the islands and in a way brought about a world that left the islands behind. So again, a spiral temporality. This is Orkney again in the future. So here we have a character called Olaf, who is singing a lullaby for his child and imagining the futures that his child might be in. And it's written in the Orkney language, the Orkney dialect, and I'm not going to give you the English this time, so you'll just have to keep up. That's fine. Olaf hushen his bairn to sleep. The sang is auld, and the week by was the bairn just taken 2 or 3 steps. A hardly human nacho need, but walking. The bairn's in is closen, and under the sang is Olaf's questions. While they tak to the wheels ducts, smoothing labs o' a night, Clem is possessed o' a tale, door to be teen out of the yawls, learn the hidden nooks o' the station and names o' the lights. Like him, his mother, and hers, lang syne, pure mixter station folk, making a piece together, sharing the bit they're gotten, no kenning ground. Or will this bairn be something new? 10 year and they'll be getting as tall as their room is wide, and learning grand astrometry and politics. The politics they're got in here is just enough to dale their mate and finish a tullio without the body murdered. They're a planet to measure. The only subject Olaf enjoyed at the school was history. He kens the world is now expanding faster again, and that new speeds tak newer worlds, channels to sight Arcadia, where all that bides is history. Station ginted brackalation, void hulks. So maybe this bairn will want to brack the next speed barrier, or the next. And this peedy bunk, dreaming o' cities, dreaming o' meaning more, or dreaming o' love for a dwining peace. What one o' this futures is bracket most? That's that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Again, amazing reading. I'm having so much fun. Well, our final panelist for this evening is TL Huchu Tendai, whose work has appeared in Lightspeed, Interzone, Analog Science Fiction and Fact, and elsewhere. He is the winner of an Alex Award, the Children's Africana Book Award, a Nomo Award for African SFF, and has been shortlisted for the Kane Prize and the Grand Prix de l'Imaginaire. The Mystery at Dunvegan Castle, the 3rd installment in his Edinburgh Nights fantasy series, is due out in summer 2023. Tendai, take it away.
Hey, thank you, Oliver. Thank you, everyone. I'm really glad to be here. It's always a bummer when you go after people that are much smarter than you are, and you're left flailing for what to say. But the good thing for me is that at least my approach to this is as a reader primarily, as opposed to a creator. I think, I might be a writer, but most of the stuff that I do is consuming content in SFF and stuff. And this got me thinking about conversations of my friends and I have been having over the last few years. By friends here, I'm talking of Zimbabwean males of a certain generation, approaching middle age, but we still think we're young and fresh. So we grew up listening to 4 FM radio stations in Zimbabwe. That's all the country had to offer. Pretty much Radio 1, 2, 3, or 4. That was it. And as such, we all grew up listening to the same music. So we have a certain kind of cultural touchstone that's solidified sometime in the late 80s, music from the 90s, maybe extending into the early 2000s or thereabouts. But nowadays, when we do get to congregate, we sort of lament those good old days. We increasingly find we're not listening to the same stuff anymore. Streaming, born out of the internet, has sort of like opened up a wide range of options, and we're all inside of our own personalized taste bubbles. We discover that instead, maybe our tastes were never even the same. Back in the day, we simply got by on what was available to us. And I viewed the situation to do with music as somewhat analogous to canon, right? Whereas before, when we were growing up in Zimbabwe, our tastes were curated by state media. It's these state broadcasters that decided which artists we listened to and which songs that had gone past the censorship board were suitable listening. And now we kind of pay the price for this additional freedom and choice that we have. But as a result, we also view the good old days with a certain sense of nostalgia. And I'm sure you can tie this into some of the madness that happens whenever Worldcon comes around, and these questions about canon and what's happening on the SFF scene. It was nicer when we had the charts or these awards that told us this is what was worth listening to. But with what's happening nowadays, for me, when I think about my reading material as well, growing up, I went to these sort of like former all-white schools, that were designed for white Rhodesian kids in the 80s. And a lot of the stuff that we consumed in the libraries, there was this golden age SFF. But nowadays, the stuff that I'm reading, when I think about the works that I encounter, it becomes a little bit chaotic. I mean, if you're into sort of like Chinese translation, there's a lot of good stuff that's on Clarksworld, Shoreline of Infinity. If you read that wonderful Scottish magazine, has done a BAME issue, LGBTQ, and I know, having worked with them, that they take these kind of issues seriously. So if you are looking for content that's a little bit different from what's been there before, there are pockets. And here I'm focusing primarily on stuff outside of sort of like the big mainstream publishers, but whether it's independent creators doing it for themselves or small startups like Omenana, the African SFF magazine that I thoroughly enjoy reading, or the work of people like Ogenchowe, Donald Ekpeki, who has started this line of really wonderful anthologies that he creates. So I guess what I'm trying to say here is, by reading this and now moving on to my role as a creator, what you read is what you write, or what you create is also heavily influenced. You're always in conversation with the other people working in your particular era and time. And for me, having access to all these people working really influences my work. So the alternative to canon might be content. I know that's sometimes taken as a derogatory word, but I love the chaoticness of it. And when Josie was speaking, I mean, she's stolen my best lines. The idea that you can sort of like curate your own playlist as opposed to having this state-mediated stuff come at you is very liberating. And that's the kind of stuff that fuels my own writing now. Thank you.
Wow. I mean, that's a fabulous place to start. I think after having listened to everyone's initial responses to the question, the first thing that struck me is everyone seems to have a different idea of what the word canon even means. I feel like it's quite a personal thing for everyone. So I might put that question out there. What are we talking about when we're talking about canon? What does it mean to you? Maybe we want to start with Amal. You caught my eye first of all.
Sure. Actually, before can I be very obnoxious? And
yes,
before I answer that question, because it's one of those, big definitional questions, but I just wanted to say, I really wanted to connect something that, and please correct me if my pronunciation is wrong. Is it Tendai or Tendai?
Tendai.
Tendai, thank you.
Thank you.
So I wanted to connect something Tendai said to something Josie said, because I think it's really, really revelatory. And certainly like the first time I encountered this idea, it sort of blew my mind. Which is just what Josie was saying about cycles and like things that repeat and things. One of the things that repeats is this idea of nostalgia that Tendai is talking about, where, I mean, one of the cycles that is just we cannot escape is that of having a childhood and getting older, and because we are apes with memory, reflecting on that childhood and then arriving at some value judgment about where we are versus where we remember being. And it's astonishing. You can find so many iterations of this in the world. Most recently, perhaps, there's a man whose name I cannot remember, but whose thing on Twitter is to make threads of a statement in the media that currently exists, like, kids today have no respect for their elders, and tracing just how old that statement is and how far back you can take it, tracing it specifically through Western news media, through like, say, 200 years, before then finding some classical antecedent for it. But so that's, like a big, obvious kind of bromide-y one. But other ones are things like, people just don't remember how to work hard anymore, or everyone, like, just all of these ideas that sort of are almost produced by people getting older and reflecting on where they are versus where they were in the past. And some of them are very astonishing. So I just wanted to kind of put those things in conversation to start with, and say that I think that because those things really inform my ideas of what a canon is. Like, I feel like there is for me what I was taught a canon is, and there's a kind of structure around that. Like, I learned what a canon is in the context of a university, which is an institution with its own modalities and sorts of stuff. But then there is, a sort of aspirational idea for me of what a canon is. And the received idea is a sense of, like, what's her name? I'm so sorry. My brain is impaired by the last 3 years. So I don't have great recall on things that I used to do very easily. Barbara something, who wrote an article that was called Contingencies of Value, I think, and was specifically talking, one of the things that recurs in this way is arguments about canons, specifically in an educational context. If you Google the canon wars, you'll get like 3 different clusters at least of temporal arguments about what belongs on a campus. You'll get conversations in the 80s being like, all these feminists ruining the canon, insisting that we read women's work when it's obviously just the reason we don't is because it's not as good as the men's work that we have, including it is just some kind of sop to whatever that period's, political correctness terminology was. And then you get another one in the 90s, and then you get another one, like roughly every 15 years, there is some crisis on university campuses about what these kids today, they just don't have any respect for the canon. So there's like those versions where the idea of the canon is what deserves to be perpetuated because it has proven its worth on some level. And I want to say, Ollie, like, wait, I said Ollie. May I call you Ollie? I don't know. It was an email. Okay. Thank you. So there was like the way that you began this panel by saying, you know, here is the new canon of SFF. I absolutely felt, you know, the positive valence that you gave to that, and that like that there is a kind of honorific involved in being like, these are the people worth reading now, right? But there is another way of thinking of canon to my mind, which is it is a tool, essentially, a tool for structuring a conversation or for receiving information, right? There is like something that Josie brought up in our email chain before was just, you know, how many different canons there are, and that they don't necessarily have to be inherited. They can be encountered in our present moment. And to me, what's wonderful about that is just like the structure of a conversation, the protocols of a conversation involve a kind of lateral give and take of what we have, like, and part of that is what we've received, part of that is what we want to perpetuate, part of that's what we want to share. But ideally for me, a canon is a start point for conversation. I would like to think of it in terms of, you know, we have a lot of I think a lot of anxiety around the idea of education and learning and how like form identity formation and stuff like that. But one of the ways I think about canon is something like, if I'm getting into anime, right? And I don't know where to start, my friends who are super into anime will, through their knowledge of me, curate for me a list of things that include things they think it's important for me to know because they're kind of structural mainstays of the genre of anime, the media of anime. And then other things that they might tailor specifically to my tastes, other things that are very, very important to them specifically that they want to share with me. And out of those different impulses emerges something that will become a kind of touch point for our friendship, right? For our conversations. And I like to think of that scaling in our other conversations about canon. So I'm going to stop talking. I'm sorry. I realize I get very excited about an idea. Throwing the ball back.
Does anyone want to respond to that?
Yeah, I co-sign all of that. So agree, yes, hard agree, as they say. I think there's something really, this isn't particularly about SFF, so forgive me, but something really interesting is happening at the moment, which is the that I've been seen happening in real time over the last 3 years, which is the attempt to establish a trans literature canon, like right now, because we've had this what gets referred to as an emergence of trans literature. Actually, that's happened twice already, cycles. There was a Paris Review article about the emergence of trans literature, and then a few years later, there was a New York Times article about it, and blah, 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 blah. And what they're actually talking about is American publishers publishing novels that are by trans people. Like that's what they're talking about there. Because of course, we've always been writing, and of course, we've always been publishing. It's just that sometimes those forms of writing and publishing, those forms of telling stories haven't been visible to the imperial core, right? And now they are visible to the imperial core, and they're a source of profit within the imperial core. And that's what gets referred to as the emergence of trans literature. And so we see, like, happening live, the process of canon formation. And so now you can Google, like, give me 10 novels by trans people to read. And you can see, you know, some of them are attempting to construct a diverse canon. Some of them haven't even thought about it. Some of them have remembered to consider the idea that books are written in languages other than English, and some of them haven't. And you see this contest like happening all at the same time. And in the majority, you'll see lists like 10 novels by trans writers you must read right now, which I hate this like demand of must read that we put on people. It's awful. In the main, they're almost all going to be novels that are fiction novels, prose fiction novels that are published in North America in the main, right? And then you see people also trying to challenge that at the same time. And something I'm wondering is whether this is even something that we want to engage with right now at all. It is all that we're doing who is we here? Trans writers? Are we a we? Are we cohesive enough to be a we? Probably not. But is all we're doing like producing value for capital? Like, is that all we're doing by creating these lists? For the last 5 or 6 years, I have partly privately and partly publicly been compiling a list of every single piece of published fiction I can find that is written by a trans person and has a trans character in it. It's up to about 400 books of novels and short stories now. And the earliest of them is the l'histoire. I'm not going to do it all in French. The story of the Marquise de Bonville by the Abbé de Choisy, which is a hilarious T for T love story written by a 17th, 18th century cross-dressing French priest, and possibly Charles Perrault. It's not clear, but Charles Perrault might have co-written it. I know, right? Hit me up for the deets afterwards. It's really bizarre. It's really bizarre. Also mostly forgotten. Anyway, where was I? So that's the earliest text. And then every year, like, the graph has become like an asymptote as publishing has discovered that we write books and some people want to buy them. And I was going to make a website to host this thing. And I was going to like try and make all of this data public. But the more I did it, the more the problems with what I was trying to do became clear. Like, what counts as published? Do I include like everyone who's put a story on itch.io, which I probably should, because that's where a lot of the most interesting writing is. Do I even want to direct everybody's attention towards that thing? What counts as fiction? What counts as a novel? How do I even account for like the millions and millions and millions of words that people have put on fan fiction websites over the last 30 years, in which a lot of trans writing has emerged? And when I do this work of private canon formation, who have I lost along the way? And when I create this list, all of the inequalities that dominate the publishing industry, which include whiteness, which include patriarchy, which include imperialism and coloniality, all of those become replicated in any kind of expansive trans canon formation that I might try and do. So do I even want to do that? So the result of which is I have a spreadsheet that nobody else has access to, unless you ask me very, very nicely, because I actually don't think I want to put it in public in that form. I think there might be something else that I want to do. Maybe I want to resist the idea of canon formation.
Can I just throw in a thing to that? Like, everything that you just described, Josie, is are you familiar with Henry Louis Gates Jr.? So he's
a little.
He was the editor of the first Norton anthology of African American literature, and he wrote this piece. I'm so sorry. I will dig it up for you later if you're interested, about the processes of trying to form this book, because it was all exactly those questions. What are you going to include in that? Are you going to include exclusively writing by Black people in America? How are you going to constitute that? What are the temporal bounds of that? And who are you going to count as American in that context? Are you going to include only fiction? Are you only going to include Black people who are writing about the experience of being Black or not? Like, all of those questions really like come up, and it's a really, really interesting piece that I recommend, because there's a lot of his gestures towards answering them are very incomplete, and he recognizes that. And I think that his ultimate conclusion is basically any canon is necessarily incomplete. And what I wanted to ask in response to that, not to throw off everyone else talking about canon, but I sort of wonder sometimes if the maybe not opposite and maybe not antidote, but somewhere between those things to a canon is actually an archive, because it sounds to me like that is a little bit what you're building, is a kind of archive. And the thing about an archive is that it attempts to accumulate and recuperate a lot of things, and then it's a matter of like how to access and how to curate and how to structure all of the things that are in there. But anyways, I thought I would throw that out because I'm also very interested in ideas of archive. That's all. Okay.
Yeah. I'm gonna quickly chuck this whole conversation over to Iain, because I am very, very interested to find out what canon means to you as a visual artist. And indeed, Josie touched on fan fiction, and I know you're involved in fan art communities.
Yeah, that's a really difficult question as well. I feel like visual canon. I was talking about this with my wife earlier, but visual canon is not really got anything to do with the literary canon. It's an entirely different tradition. And I think, like a lot of the panelists, I almost don't know what it is. And I think when I try and imagine it, what I imagine is an extremely caricatured version of like a Forbidden Planet poster kind of version of an SFF canon, which is clearly not anything to do with the works that are coming out at the moment, which are winning the Hugo Best Artwork and things like that. That there's anything that you would think of as being a canon, for me, is just that stuff that happened in the 1970s and 80s that you may or may not reference, but it's not, to me, something that is sort of dominating the visual landscape or any kind of conversations about art, except perhaps in an archival or nostalgic way. I do very much agree with the rest of the panel that I think canon is almost a personal thing, and it's about, to me anyway, it's almost about the influences that I draw on and how wide are those, and how much have I been exposed to, and therefore what are the biases that are inherent in the things that I'm drawing on, which I would have a much broader palette if only I had explored a bit more. And so I think what interests me about the idea of curating canon and having a personal canon and having those lists of things that you might need to know, things you must read, things you must see, is in bringing things to the attention of other people who might not have otherwise encountered them. And if those lists are always the 10 best white male fantasy authors, then that doesn't achieve its goal. And so having multiple canons, which are suggestions of things that people might be interested in, they can go and explore, and that they're surfacing things that they might find useful in chewing on and digesting and regurgitating into their own creativity. I think that's really important. And in as much as canon matters at all as a sort of big concept, it's almost in gaining a certain critical mass so that the kinds of lists that get written aren't the best 10 male white fantasy authors, but inherently and unquestioningly just assume that there are these other people who you also need in that conversation, and nobody would even dream of writing the 10 male list anymore, which sadly they do still write on a regular basis. Or maybe it'll be ChatGPT that's writing it from now on, I don't know. But what you need is almost the concept of the sort of Johari window. What's in the central frame of everybody's conversation? What's the canon that everybody is talking about? And how do we include more and more stuff in that so it is broader and it's a series of big overlapping influences that people can draw on? Because I mean, when I was younger, I was reading like Arthur C. Clarke and Bob Shaw, but I was also reading Anne McCaffrey and Vonda McIntyre and Catherine Kerr and all of these other people, and I never really thought that there was any difference in there were these people I ought to be reading. There were the people I was aware of, and I read those people. And so the danger in not having any canon at all is that you almost only become aware of the people who everybody else is talking about, and those people are really boring and staid and the people you were talking about 50 years ago, which is not what you would ever really want. You want new things, you want new influences, and you want a broader set of perspectives to draw on.
Thanks,
that was
Iain.
very rambly.
Yeah, Tendai, do you got any?
Yeah, I was just thinking of something Iain just said, which is awareness of what's there, and I think it almost ties in with what Amal was talking about, the difference between archiving and canon. Even though with archives there's a certain degree of curation that still goes on there, but I think certainly the archival format sounds to me at least a little bit more inclusive than the formation of a canon, which is kind of based on pretty much on exclusion until we get that best of 10 white male writer list that Iain was talking about. But when I think about this whole thing, and I understand sort of like the arguments that are made about how these things are created in academia and so forth, I'm more interested in something Josie also touched in, which is the role of capital I have a friend who's a publisher at an editor for HarperCollins in India, and he came through a few months ago to Edinburgh, something to do with the British Council, and we're just having a conversation about publishing out there, and he was like, the one thing that he lamented was the fact that HarperCollins India, bought a lot more material rights to publish works from here than HarperCollins in Britain bought from them. And I was like, I've got all these exciting writers that I publish, but each time I put them forward and say, you know, this is really good, you've got to read this, we just get a no. And they'll buy one or two occasionally in the year, but nothing much. And so the money flows from India to the center, as it were. And I do have that feeling that it's, by the time we talk about, you know, another $1 billion spent on a Lord of the Rings adaptation, and you have the whole the whole controversy about, you know, characters of color being included in there, etc. And then you hear this stuff about a new Harry Potter, which is exactly what we need in this current historical moment. You know, who knows? Maybe they'll give us that Black Hermione now because, you know, there was the musical controversy, and it's so exciting. It will be so diverse and wonderful. But the money seems to flow back to the same spaces, and that's something for me as a creator that I am very wary of. I started off my publishing journey getting stuff published by small independent publishers. My first publisher was River Press in Zimbabwe, and they had the rights to my first novel, and I'm now published by Tor, which is part of Pan Macmillan, and so you get a lot more visibility and exposure and all the rest of that with a big publisher. But it does feel, in a sense, to be selling out. But I don't know how, you know, perhaps my question to everyone else who's on the panel would be, how do you deal with that? Because, you know, I do get that sense of selling out, and then there's always the question of my landlord who demands his rent paid at the end of the month. So this question of capital and canon, who gets included, who gets excluded, but ultimately who benefits from the creation of these works that are being peddled.
Yeah, fabulous. Thank you. Sorry, I'm cross-checking questions with everything else. But just quickly before we get into audience questions, I wanted to pose one more question to the panel, which was, we've touched a lot on canon, and there's another key word in this question today that I really wanted to ask you about, which is the word challenge, and the kind of things, because we're talking a lot about capital, about how publishing reinforces certain things, how publishing is almost responsible for canon up to a certain point. But I think there are some texts out there, some pieces of art out there that do challenge in ways that are beneficial to SFF. I'm thinking of Deep Wheel Arcadia especially, which explodes the idea of sort of what a book can be in terms of a novel. But yeah, I wanted to put that out there. What is there out there that does put out that challenge for you, that that is doing good, challenging work? Let's start with Josie. Yeah.
Oh Lord. I mean, it's funny that, like, thank you for saying such a kind thing. That's very nice. I'm glad that you find something useful, like a challenge in that book. I think, like, I have to say, like, for myself, that I was never actually setting out to challenge anyone. Genuinely, like, I wasn't setting out to write a book that was tilted again. I think this is what I'm trying to say. I wasn't setting out to write a book that was tilted against anything. I wasn't defining it against something. I was only defining it in terms of it itself, and I followed my heart, and I wrote exactly what I wanted to write because it pleased me. And if there was anything that I was up that I was tilting against with that book, it was just monolingualism as a curse that shrouds this island on which I currently live. Yeah, the island of Britain, the enforced monolingualism of our literary culture is stultifying and deeply un-sci-fi, like deeply boringly un-sci-fi. Like it's like we've willed the universal translator, we've willed the Babel fish like into the present, except what it is English, which is frankly quite a boring language compared to lots of other languages. So that's something that I was tilting against. You asked me to name things that are exciting me or that I'm finding challenging right now, and I've just given you a blurb about myself and what else I was up to. But I'm going to have a think and come back to that question. But I'll hand over to the others.
I'll dive in to say I think that so there's a lot in the idea of challenge, right? Where I think of like the first thing that came to mind for me in terms of maybe instead of challenge, say like address, perhaps like something that exists in the past or that you have received and that you want to kind of send into the future differently, is retellings, essentially, like fairy tale retellings, mythology retellings, which are really having a moment right now. This is another cyclical thing that happens. I remember when I started working in a bookstore for the first time in something like 2003 or 2004, there were a great deal of retellings of mythology and fairy tales at that moment that were having a sort of literary heyday. And then they kind of went underground for a while, and then they had another resurgence like now, and everything is sort of being packaged the way that Madeline Miller's books are packaged, you know, to sort of replicate that. But I think that there are, like when I think of Naivo's The Chosen and the Beautiful, you know, which is a retelling of F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby and stuff, right? There's a kind of there is something in like holding up the familiar received story, which has become a kind of touch point in its own right, and holding it up in the light of your own experience or your own difference, finding some point of ingress, you know, towards this thing, and then opening it up from that point, I think is really interesting. I tried to do that with a short story of mine that was a fairy tale retelling. It's called Seasons of Glass and Iron. And the reason I did that, like, it came out of a moment where my niece, who at the time was 7 years old, asked me to tell her a fairy tale while we were on a long car journey. And I suddenly had this anxiety of like, I know so many fairy tales, but are any of them appropriate to tell to this small child in this moment? Like, I felt this enormous weight of responsibility. I found myself wanting to tell her a fairy tale in which, for instance, like women helped each other out, or two girls were friends, or something like that. And those probably exist, except that in that moment there was a weight of all of the other versions of those stories that involve, which I think are like, I want to be very clear here. I think wicked stepmothers are fantastic. And I think like all the dark, scary, awful things that happen in fairy tales are fantastic. And I love them. But this was my 7-year-old niece. And so there was a certain degree of like thinking through a whole bunch of stuff. And what I ended up doing was like mashing two fairy tales together and making something else out of them. Like, what if a girl who was forced to walk in iron shoes met a girl who was forced to sit on a glass hill? Could the iron shoes help her climb the glass hill? Could they like talk to each other? Could they emerge from those stories together? So I told her this story in a very sort of aimed at 7-year-old way. And then a couple of years later, or no, shortly thereafter, I was invited to write a fairy tale retelling for an anthology. And I was like, I think I'll do that thing. Maybe I'll try and write it, that story that I told. So I feel like there's just, I feel like whenever we write things that are in any way challenging or troubling or addressing something that exists in the world, I feel like to give it, I want to be very aware of what power we give it by saying that we are challenging it, and also what power we're ascribing to ourselves in changing it, you know. But I don't know, I don't have any solid answers here. It's just I feel like there are a lot of things that we take for granted in the way that we approach stories and telling stories that that I don't want to take for granted, that I kind of want to interrogate the specificities and granularities of. But anyway, I can certainly say there is a whole lot of fiction that is currently actually challenging and as well as addressing things like, you know, the legacy of H.P. Lovecraft, or the transphobia and transmisogyny of J.K. Rowling, and that all of these, like, I mean, let me think about it. So like, what is a good recent wizard book? Wizard. There are so many wizard school books, I feel, that are coming out now specifically to kind of, you know, challenge the behemoth of like Harry Potter's place in the world, for instance, and stuff.
Right.
So
Juno Dawson just did a very funny one.
Yes, I love, oh my gosh, Juno Dawson's Her Majesty's Royal Coven, right? Like, I haven't read the sequel yet. I'm so excited. I have it at home. But yeah,
Is the sequel out? I didn't even catch that. Oh wow.
It's a trilogy.
I
know.
Exciting.
Yeah. So anyway, I'll stop though, because there are many, but they are very available.
So we've got about 10 minutes left and a couple of audience questions. Off the back of thinking about folklore, we have a question which I'll direct Iain's way specifically, which is thinking about Josie's point about the past as temporality to frame canon, and also thinking about Iain's use of Scottish folklore thematics. How is Scottish folklore, still a live tradition, a way to challenge and reframe canons?
No idea. I think again, for me, it's about drawing on influences that maybe have been less explored in what you might consider, but only in an extremely caricatured way, canon, and trying to unearth things that you think maybe haven't been depicted and find ways into them. I'm very conscious in these days of Midjourney of not producing artwork that people might look at and go, did Midjourney do that? And if there's anything, I guess if I was going to point to anything that I would say is the sort of canon of SFF art, it's the kind of stuff that Midjourney churns out in 0.6 nanoseconds, and you know exactly what it is, and it looks like SFF art, and it could be a cover or an illustration from a heavy metal album from the 1970s or something, and it's not lacking in beauty, but it's lacking in something that is unique and inspiring and drawing on something that isn't just the ground up, chewed up product of everything that's ever happened in popular culture averaged out to its absolute statistical mean. And so as soon as you try and get into something that's a little bit more gristly and interesting and lesser known and inherently therefore more quirky and unique, I think that can only be a good thing, because it makes art that could only be that thing, could only be itself and not just be the average of everything else.
Thank you for that. We have a question I'm going to paraphrase from Colin Clark. It's very, very long, which I'll direct at Tendai, which is basically, does anyone need a canon? Is canon actually useful to you at all?
Yeah, I think I'll go with the most explanation that if you're going into anime and you know nothing about it, your friends might say, well, you need to watch this and that, and that's how you get into it. Certainly, for me, when I was sort of like really beginning to take writing seriously, I had the sense that I'd been left behind due to the availability of books in Zimbabwe, and So I used to follow these lists, you know, that would tell me this is what's important, this is the stuff that you're supposed to know. And that way, when you were, say, at a literary thing and they were talking about all these canonical writers, you could at least brag about it. You know, you had that sort of like cultural currency that you needed to enter these spaces. And I think that's primarily the reason it exists, that whole thing of exclusion, that we've got this bunch of people that have been drilled into believing this is important. And by the time they leave the academic institutions or whatever, and they're working in publishing and TV and film, the decisions they make are informed by the stuff that they've consumed and been told that this is how it is done. And so I think it's important. It's also very, very problematic in that sense. But I don't think we'll ever get over the feeling that we kind of need to curate, at least when it comes to well, pretty much any work of art, the idea that we want to have a sense of what is the best that was produced or the most influential. But I do think that's why we have these panels, because I mean, just a certain kind of awareness of that will lead you onto different paths. And I think ultimately it's down to the individual. And as readers or consumers of art, we can be a bit lazy and just get caught up in the shiny stuff that's like right at the front of the bookstore, instead of looking in different nooks and crannies for stuff that's, and if you look for it and if you are interested, it's there.
Reminded of a debate at a different thing about Tolkien and the amount of shelf space he gets and why that perpetuates the Tolkien sort of narrative. Mm-hmm. We have a question from Dimitra, which is Tendai himself writing against a canon or in the gaps of a canon?
Jesus, that's a really difficult one for me to say. Again, because I'm aware of the fact that you know, I've been published as I have means the stuff that I'm producing is recognizable and is sellable and marketable to the people that make those kind of like decisions. And so it would be really sexy for me to say I'm rebelling against this or that, and it would look good as an artist. But I do think that there is kind of a medium there. And you know, I think about stuff like now, maybe if I move away from my own work, but something that I'm really excited about. There's this book coming out later on this year called Shigidi by this Nigerian author who lives and works as an engineer in Malaysia called Shigidi. And it's pretty much this magical heist novel, high octane, really exciting. But because of his Nigerian origins and living in Asia, Talabi draws on some really interesting cultures, some that I had not encountered before, and does something really, really fresh and different and invigorating. And he has this easy ability to weave in gods and different monsters and mythological beings from all these different cultures, doing it so seamlessly. But as I was reading it, I could see the influences of Gaiman's American Gods, and I could understand why this work would have appealed to a publisher. It's a rollicking read. But I'm always thinking in the sense that once you've been introduced to these mythologies, the next generation of writers might have a greater degree of freedom, since the audience will be aware of these things. And so I try to sort of think in terms of longer timescales than my own sort of like individual work as to what might happen further down the line. Does this make any sense at all? Oh, thank goodness. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Tendai. Yeah, you've all done brilliantly. We have like 3 minutes left, and I'd like to invite you each, if you have just a couple of really short closing remarks before we end, to give those. I'll fire it off at Amal's.
Oh, sorry,
unmuted.
I
Go
will
for it.
actually be brief. I just wanted to say something to pick up on what Tendai said. I want to try out a metaphor for the idea of canons. I sort of wonder if there's a way in which we can consider canons as passports into specific conversations. And I say this with the full awareness of all the baggage that a passport has and that borders have, and that they are both, that there are barriers, and that those are barriers that produce certain certain ideas of community, like, and stuff like that. Bearing all of that in mind, I think that something that I felt was also missing from our conversation was what Tendai brought up, which is the that legitimizing element of, when there is a canon, that means that someone can potentially absorb that canon in order to participate in conversations among people who possess certain kinds of social capital and social power and stuff. So there is a history of, in Britain, certainly, working class people being able to engage in a tradition of like autodidactism, where because there's a set of books, which if you read these books, that means that you have gained an education that allows them to kind of, climb a certain ladder and stuff. That sort of thing becomes more dispersed later on, and there are questions about, who benefits from that ultimately. But anyway, I want to throw that out there, thinking of a canon as a passport with all the baggage that entails.
Thank you. Iain. You're muted.
I can't unmute, apparently.
There we
No,
go.
I don't think I have anything coherent to add to that, but I agree with all of that. Thank you.
Thank you, Iain. Josie?
First, just Tendai and Amal, I've read your books for a good few years now, and I've loved them, and it's a joy to get to do this panel with you. And Iain, it's been really nice to get to know your art, which I didn't know before, and now want to know a lot more about. So thank you for that. I'm going to pick up the other half of the question that I didn't manage to answer earlier, which is what's challenging that I'm excited about at the moment. And the truth is that, like, what's really challenging in my life at the moment right now is that I've been quite intensively learning Gaelic, Scottish Gaelic, for the last couple of years, which is a process that I'm still underway, and it's been a delightful challenge for me. And there's more than one, but I think the best known sci-fi book in Scottish Gaelic is Tim Armstrong's and Cúin Dú Drilseach, which probably very few people in this audience will be able to read because it hasn't been translated and has resisted translation. And speaking as somebody who wrote a book for a language with like 10,000 speakers and did translate it, I'm very impressed with somebody who's written a book for a language which has like a maximum of about, 50,000 readers and refused to translate it. And that challenge, I think, is really, really important. And it means that book is not visible to a lot of sci-fi cultures in a way that it might otherwise be, but it does mean it can do some other work within its own language and in its own literature. That said, if you're like tempted and infuriated by the idea of a book that you can't read, which is really good and really important, maybe you should away and learn Gaelic or one of the other many languages in these islands, because they're here and they're there for you to learn, and Duolingo is free. So
thanks, Josie. And finally, Tendai, you got anything else to finish us off?
How time flies, eh? Thank you all so much. It's been an absolute pleasure sharing this panel with you. The final word for me would just be a recommendation. Can I just recommend anyone who's looking for something different, try this magazine, Omenana, which is based in Nigeria. It publishes a lot of like great African sci-fi. Omenana, that's Omenana. And if you're looking for something with a Scottish bent, then you've got to try out Shoreline of Infinity. That's the best I can do. Leave you with reading recommendation. Thank you.
Okay, massive thank you to everyone. This has been some scintillating discussion, and I wish we had another hour or two to go through it. But I will hand back to Dimitra.
Wow, what a way to end the series. Thank you all so very much for absolutely brilliant contributions. It's been, yeah, as Ollie was saying, I have no idea where the time has gone. I'm suddenly thinking, oh my gosh, this is finishing. We haven't even started here. But, you know, we'll have to stick to the rules here and let you go. But of course, if people want to continue the conversation, Marita posted the link to our Discord event. We might actually do a sort of timed meeting of people who want to discuss further on Discord as well. And we will let you know via Eventbrite. So all that remains for me to do is to sort of close this series, really. I can't believe it. I really can't believe it that we've got here, but especially with all the, you know, the difficulties we've had this year, but we've had some amazing contributions, both from the creative practitioners, but also the academic responses too. There's still 2 academic responses to come. We will let you know once those are on the website via Eventbrite. But can I thank, first of all, the HRC for funding this, my co-investigator, Professor Esther McCallum-Stewart. Can I please, and Marita, please show your face. Can I please thank Marita for all her hard work as the network coordinator? She's been absolutely stellar, and I have no idea how any of that would have happened without her. So many, many thanks, Marita. Also, many thanks to volunteers like Madalena Dalazio, who's done live tweeting, Emma French as well, Grace Worm, also so many people from the Centre of Fancy and the Fantastic who came to support these events, either on Discord or via tweeting, or helping out in any possible way. So thank you all so much. The recordings will be here for posterity, so we can you know, go back and look at recommendations, etc., and we'll be in touch with the latest news for you. Thank you, Josie, Tendai, Iain, and Amal, and Ollie. This has been a brilliant event to close the series. I couldn't have hoped for anything better. Thank you all very much. Good night, everyone.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.